Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are attempting to summit what many consider the single most intimidating peak in all of philosophy. Immanuel Kant's 1781 masterwork, The Critique of Pure Reason.
It's an extraordinary text. I mean, just an absolute feat of systematic thinking. When you look at the history of Western thought, there are very few books that so radically redefine the entire playing field.
Right, it feels like this great divider. There's philosophy before Kant, and then there's philosophy after Kant.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Absolutely. And our mission today is really for you, the listener, who is approaching this monumental work. You're not just looking for a summary, you're genuinely curious about its fundamental structure, its, revolutionary intent.
You want to know why it exists?
Exactly. Why did this book have to be written? What profound problems was he trying to solve? And how did he believe he could take metaphysics, this ancient, sprawling study of ultimate reality, and finally place it on what he called the secure path of a science?
And to really grasp that, to understand the sheer scope of the task Kant set for himself, we have to start with the environment the book was born into. And that environment is just. It's characterized by immediate difficulty. Our source material, including notes from the translators, is incredibly candid about this. They state outright that Kant's German makes difficult reading even when judged by German standards.
That's just astonishing to me. It's not just that the concepts are abstract and difficult. The prose itself, the actual language, is a dense, almost architectural structure that it resists easy entry.
It really does. And if you think about it, if the greatest minds of his era struggled with the language, imagine the struggle they had with the actual ideas.
Yeah, that's a whole other level of difficulty.
It's a crucial point, and that difficulty led directly to a major issue for anyone who studies the critique today. You have to deal with two different versions of it.
It's not a single monolithic text.
Not at all. The translator has to meticulously collate the first edition, which scholars call the A edition, from 1781, and then the heavily revised second edition, the B edition, which came out 6 years later in 1787.
Which suggests that Kant felt he was either deeply misunderstood or that he'd made some critical errors in how he presented everything the first time around.
I think it was both, actually. The initial feedback was, well, it was brutal. Critics either ignored the book entirely or they just fundamentally misinterpreted the main thrust of his argument.
So he felt compelled to try again.
He did. He revised it extensively, especially in the section dealing with the deduction of the categories, which we'll get into. But here's the interesting part for scholars. They found that while the B versions clarified certain arguments, the original A versions are often considered, and I'm quoting here, indispensable for an adequate understanding of the very passages he substituted.
So you can't just read the fixed version.
You can't. If you're reading the critique seriously, you are, in effect, reading two different books at the same time. You're constantly flipping between the A and B margin references just to figure out what Kant really meant, or maybe what he changed his mind about.
It's like tracking the evolution of his thought in real time.
It is, exactly. And this dual reference system is necessary because he was constantly refining his arguments, sometimes completely restructuring entire sections. The translator's notes even highlight this bizarre necessity of relying on Kant's punctuation. His very meticulous, if sometimes overly complex, punctuation, because it's so very helpful in many difficult and doubtful passages.
Wow. When the precise relationship between a subject and a predicate hinges on where a semicolon is placed, you know you're navigating some extremely deep waters of intellectual precision.
You really are.
Okay, so let's unpack this monumental undertaking. Before we even get into the mechanics of Kant's solution, we really need to understand the philosophical emergency that drove him to write a book this difficult in the first place. What was the state of metaphysics at the time?
Well, Kant begins with a genuinely dramatic, almost despairing diagnosis. It's in Preface A, and he describes what he calls the peculiar fate of human reason.
A peculiar fate.
Yes. He argues that reason is burdened by questions that are not arbitrary. They're prescribed by the very nature of reason itself. These are questions we have to ask.
It's in our DNA, so to speak.
It's in our cognitive DNA. But tragically, reason is not able to answer them. The questions about God, freedom, immortality, they transcend the limits of all of its possible powers.
That's a fundamental contradiction built right into our minds. Our own mental architecture forces us to ask questions that our architecture is structurally unable to resolve.
It's a recipe for permanent intellectual frustration.
Right.
And for centuries, this endeavor, metaphysics, had been, in his view, a total failure.
Right.
Kant described its procedure as this series of starts and stops. a merely random groping among mere concepts. He says, just look at the history. You see these elaborate preparations, they get frequently renewed, and then they're followed by an immediate collapse as soon as they near its goal.
And everyone's just arguing with each other.
Constantly. The participants contradicted each other, they were compelled to retrace their steps, and they could never, ever agree on a common plan. This chaotic state, Kant asserts, proves that metaphysics is very far from having entered upon the secure path of a science.
And he wasn't just being general here. He was taking direct aim at the reigning philosophies of his day. So the rationalists like Leibniz on one side and the empiricists like Hume on the other.
Precisely. He singles out Locke, for instance. Locke attempted this physiology of the human understanding, trying to trace the origins of our knowledge empirically from our senses.
A very scientific-sounding project.
It sounds scientific, but Kant argues that this attempted genealogy, this tracing of our intellectual ancestry, has, as a matter of fact, been fictitiously invented. He's saying Locke and his followers were trapped in dogmatism. They were just asserting truths without first subjecting reason itself to a rigorous internal examination.
A critique.
A critique. They were building these incredible castles on sand because they hadn't bothered to check the foundation first.
So metaphysics is stuck in this state of chaos, this battlefield, as he calls it. But Kant didn't believe reason was inherently flawed. He just believed it was using the wrong method.
Exactly. He looked around and he saw other intellectual fields that had found certainty. They were on that secure path.
Okay, so what were his models?
Well, first he contrasted metaphysics with logic. Logic, he says, since Aristotle, has been on a secure path. It is a closed and completed body of doctrine, and it only really requires refinement for elegance rather than the certainty of the science.
So logic was the gold standard for certainty.
For formal certainty, yes, because it deals only with the rules of thought itself, abstracting away from all objects. But, and this is the crucial part, logic provides no new content.
Right. It tells you if your argument is valid, but not what is actually true about the world out there.
Exactly. So the more interesting case for him was natural science. It took much, much longer to achieve that kind of certainty, but it underwent this sudden and defining intellectual revolution. He dates it to partly Bacon, about a century and a half earlier, and then dramatically accelerated by figures like Galileo and Torricelli.
And what was the core of that scientific revolution? What was the actual methodological shift that metaphysics needed to copy?
It was this realization that reason must not be a passive observer. It can't just let nature keep reason, as it were, in nature's leading strings.
So the old approach was just to watch and wait.
Right. Observe, hope some pattern would spontaneously emerge from the data. The new approach was completely revolutionary. Reason must constrain nature to give answer to questions of reason's own determining.
Okay, so it's the difference between, say, walking around a forest hoping a bear shows up versus setting very specific traps designed to catch that bear based on a prior hypothesis of where the bear travels and what it eats.
That's an excellent way to put it, a really excellent analogy. Kant realized that any observations made in obedience to no previously thought-out plan can never yield a necessary law. It will always just be a collection of accidents.
You need a framework.
You need a framework. To find a necessary law, something that must be true reason, needs a proactive, rational structure to guide the experiment. The structure of the questions you ask must be imposed by the mind, forcing the object, nature, to conform to the rational structure of the investigator.
The subject.
The subject. And this realization, that was the foundational insight for saving metaphysics.
This brings us to Kant's core methodological proposal then, the thing designed to rescue metaphysics by imitating this very structural shift he saw in math and natural science.
This is his celebrated Copernican revolution.
And the analogy is just perfect because it's all about flipping the entire assumption of where the center of the universe lies.
Yeah, precisely. For centuries, the traditional assumption in philosophy was, to put it simply, that all our knowledge must conform to objects. Our minds are passive receptors. They're like wax tablets. And truth is measured by how accurately we mirror the external reality. This assumption, Kant noted, had repeatedly failed to produce necessary a priori knowledge, knowledge that is certain and universal. If the object dictates everything, our knowledge can only ever be contingent and empirical. It's always just what happens to be the case.
So enter the radical new hypothesis, mirroring Copernicus.
Right. Copernicus, he couldn't explain heavenly motion by assuming everything revolved around the spectator, around Earth. So he tried the opposite.
He made the spectator move.
He made the spectator Earth revolve and let the stars remain at rest. Kant applied this directly to metaphysics. He suggested, what if we try the assumption that the object, specifically the objects as an object of our senses, must conform to the constitution of our faculty of intuition?
Wait, okay, let me just make sure I'm grasping the profound weight of that shift. It means that the necessity we see in the world, like the necessity of causality, or the fact that things exist in space and time, that necessity is not in the thing itself, but is imposed by our mind as a necessary condition for us to experience anything at all.
You hit the nail on the head. That is the revolution. If objects, as we experience them, conform to our innate concepts, then we can know things a priori with absolute necessity, because we are simply describing the rules that we ourselves imposed.
We're describing our own cognitive software.
Exactly. This implies the existence of these innate concepts within the mind, to which all objects of experience necessarily conform, and with which they must agree. If the mind is the legislator, well, it can write the laws of nature beforehand.
This sounds incredibly powerful for explaining how we know the laws of physics, for example, but it immediately brings up those old transcendent problems: God, freedom, ultimate reality. If the mind structure is everything we experience, what about the things that lie outside the mind structure?
This is where the revolution forces a crucial distinction. A distinction that had, in his view, evaded all previous metaphysicians. And this is the difference between the object as an appearance, a phenomenon, and the object as a thing in itself, a noumenon.
Okay.
Kant argues this distinction is absolutely vital because it's the only way to solve the inherent logical contradictions, what he calls the antinomies, that had plagued philosophy for centuries.
The knots that reason ties itself into when it tries to talk about things like infinity or ultimate substances.
Exactly, those knots. If we stick to the traditional view that our knowledge conforms to objects as things in themselves, then when we try to conceive of the unconditioned or the absolute totality of things, we immediately run into contradiction.
For example?
Well, for example, the universe must be either finite in time or infinite in time. And he shows that both of those assertions lead to logical impossibilities if you're talking about the universe as a thing in itself. But when we realize that objects as appearances, as what is given to us through our senses, conform to our mode of representation, the contradiction just vanishes. It disappears.
Because we're no longer talking about the thing itself.
We're talking about the conditions of our experience of it. The contradiction only arises when we mistakenly try to apply the rules that are designed for the realm of appearances to things that lie outside of all possible experience, the things in themselves. So the Copernican shift justifies making this vital split, and that is what rescues reason from self-destruction.
Okay, so to formally implement this revolution, Kant needed a new, surgically precise set of tools. He had to categorize different types of knowledge. We have to start with the foundational distinctions he makes about where knowledge comes from and how it's structured.
The first and maybe the simplest distinction is between pure and empirical knowledge. And Kant is very careful here. He acknowledges that all our knowledge begins with experience in the order of time. Our cognitive faculties are awakened by objects affecting our senses. There's no doubt about that.
That sounds like pure empiricism. I mean, everything starts with the senses.
It does, but here is the critical clarification. He says that while knowledge begins with experience, not all of our knowledge arises out of experience.
Okay, that's a subtle but important difference.
It's everything. Pure knowledge, then, for him, is knowledge that is not mixed with anything extraneous. It means it contains no experience or sensation whatsoever in its logical foundation. It is knowledge we possess independently of any specific sensory input. And this independence is what he means by the term a priori.
So we've established that a priori, or pure knowledge, exists. Now we need to look at how that knowledge is framed in a proposition or a judgment. And this brings us to the famous analytic versus synthetic distinction, which is really the logical engine of the entire critique.
Yes, this distinction is absolutely non-negotiable for understanding Kant. He divides all judgments based on the relationship between the subject concept, let's call it A, and the predicate concept, B. So in analytic judgments, the predicate B is already contained in this concept A. It's just covertly implied. The connection between A and B is thought through identity.
Can you give us an example?
The classic example is all bodies are extended. The concept of extension, of taking up space, is already part of the definition of what a body is. You can't think of a body without it being extended.
Right, or all bachelors are unmarried.
Perfect. Unmarriedness is already part of the definition of a bachelor. These judgments are perfectly certain, they're necessary, But they are, and this is key, no addition to the knowledge. They just clarify concepts analytically. They don't extend our knowledge of the world, they're just definitional or tautological truths.
They just confirm what we already knew through the definition itself. We could analyze the concept of bachelor for 1,000 years and we'd never discover anything new about the world, only about the rules of that concept.
Exactly. On the other hand, you have synthetic judgments. These are the ones where the predicate B lies outside the concept A, even though it stands in connection with it. These judgments add something new to the concept, and so they extend our knowledge.
Like all bodies are heavy.
All bodies are heavy is the classic example. The concept heavy is not contained in the concept body. You have to go out into the world and experience gravity to connect those two concepts. You are synthesizing new information.
That makes perfect sense for empirical, everyday knowledge. We learn that fire is hot, that's synthetic, based on experience. And we know that a square has 4 sides, that's analytic, based on definition. But what's the big problem here for metaphysics?
The ultimate reason for the critique, the problem that kept Kant up at night, is the existence of, and the quest for, synthetic a priori knowledge.
The impossible hybrid.
The impossible hybrid. Knowledge that extends what we know that is new, but is known with absolute universal necessity, completely independent of any particular experience.
So it's not a definition, but it's as certain as one.
Precisely. Metaphysics, Kant insists, is a quite indispensable science because of our inherent rational drive. Its whole mission is to extend our a priori knowledge. And to do that, it has to use these synthetic a priori judgments. It has to employ principles that add to the given concept something that was not contained in it, while still maintaining absolute certainty.
And he thought this was possible. He had examples.
He did. All of mathematics, for instance, 7 plus 5 equals 12. He argues that the concept of 12 is not contained in the concept of 7 or 5 or plus. You have to perform an act of synthesis, an intuition, but you do it a priori. You don't need to count 12 objects to know it's true. And the law of causality. Every event must have a cause. That's not a definition, but we hold it to be universally and necessarily true.
So the existence of math and science proves this kind of knowledge is possible, but nobody knew how the mind could possibly achieve it.
That is the central defining problem of the entire work. The question is not if synthetic a priori judgments exist. They clearly do. The question is how. How can the understanding possibly arrive at this knowledge a priori? And answering that question means outlining the entire internal structure of the mind itself.
Okay, so to answer that how, Kant built this systematic map of the understanding, what he called the architectonic of the critique. He had to move from the most universal rules of thought right down to the specific mechanisms the mind uses to create experience.
Right, he starts with logic, but he immediately divides it. First, there's what he calls general logic. This is the logic we're all familiar with from Aristotle. It's totally abstract. It abstracts from all empirical conditions, and it ignores any differences in the objects being thought about.
It's purely formal.
Purely formal. It is, as the source material notes, merely a cathartic of the common understanding.
Wait, a cathartic of the common understanding. That's a fascinating phrase. What does that cleansing process actually entail?
It means it purges the mind of logical inconsistency. It cleans up the form of your thinking. General logic makes sure your arguments are non-contradictory and formally valid, but, and this is the limit, it offers zero guarantee that the content, the matter of your thought, corresponds to reality.
It's a formal firewall.
It's a formal firewall, and because it abstracts from all content, general logic cannot provide a general test of truth about the world. It can't judge objects. If you try to use general logic to gain new factual knowledge about things, it inevitably collapses into what he calls dialectic.
The ancient art of sophistry, using logic to create illusions of truth.
Historically, yes. Dialectic was the sophistical art of giving to ignorance, a mere show of objective assertions. But in the critique, the dialectic isn't just sophistry. It's assigned to logic as a critique of dialectical illusion.
Yeah.
It's the critical process of exposing where reason has misused its own formal rules to claim a material truth it simply doesn't possess.
But the real star of the show, the key to the whole Copernican revolution, is the new logic he introduces.
That is transcendental logic.
Yeah.
And this logic is unique. It's concerned specifically with how our concepts relate to objects a priori. It contains the rules for the pure concepts of the understanding. So it's not just concerned with the form of thought, but with a specific part of the content that is contributed by the mind itself.
And this new logic, this transcendental logic, is also divided into a constructive part and an error-checking part.
Exactly. The transcendental analytic is what he calls the logic of truth. This is the constructive phase. This is where he isolates the necessary elements and principles without which no object can be thought. It acts as a canon rulebook for the proper empirical employment of our understanding. It tells us how to use the mind's innate tools correctly, but strictly within the boundaries of possible experience.
And its dark counterpart, the error-checking part.
That is the transcendental dialectic, which he calls the critique of illusion. And this is necessary because reason, once you give it these powerful conceptual tools, is always tempting to use these pure modes of knowledge beyond the limits of experience. This is the source of the whole metaphysical crisis. It's the misapplication of our cognitive tools that generates transcendental illusion.
Okay, so before we even get to the mind's concepts, the raw sensory data has to be organized somehow. And that happens in the section he calls the transcendental aesthetic.
Yes, the aesthetic is absolutely foundational. It's where Kant isolates space and time. And crucially, he argues, they are not properties of things in themselves. They're not out there in the world. They are the subjective conditions of our intuition.
So they're like the fixed goggles through which we are forced to perceive reality.
That's a great analogy. They're the operating system for our senses. And they are intuited a priori. He uses geometry to prove this. You can't get the truth that the straight line between 2 points is the shortest, just from analyzing the concepts of straightness or line. You need the pure a priori intuition of space to draw it, to construct it, and to grasp its necessity.
So space and time organize raw sensation into a structured intuition. Now the transcendental analytic takes over. And its job is to organize that intuition into structured thought using what he calls the categories.
Correct. Kant's first major project in the analytic is discovering these categories. These are concepts like unity, plurality, causality, substance. He provides what he calls the clue to the discovery of all pure concepts of the understanding. They're like abstract mental blueprints.
But they're empty on their own.
Completely empty without intuition. They only serve to determine an object in general. But this raises a huge problem. How do these pure intellectual concepts like causality connect to the messy, specific, time-bound images that our senses provide?
That sounds like a philosophical crisis in itself. The abstract category of cause is purely intellectual, but the actual experienced cause always happens now or then. There's this massive gap between the pure concept and the concrete intuition.
That gap is indeed the problem, and Kant claims it's bridged by a special faculty he calls judgment. Judgment is the faculty of subsuming under rules. It's the ability to see that a particular thing falls under a general rule.
Okay.
But here is a fascinating and kind of brutal point he makes. He says judgment is a peculiar talent, is almost an innate instinct, what he calls mother wit. And he says a deficiency in judgment is ordinarily called stupidity, and it is something that can be practiced only and cannot be taught.
Ouch. That is harsh. If judgment, the faculty that actually applies the rules, is innate and can't be taught by logic, doesn't that undermine the entire point of the critique as an instructional guide? How can logic help us if the application part is purely instinctual?
It's a great challenge. And Kant's answer is that general logic can't teach judgment because it's too abstract, it has no content. But transcendental logic can guide it, but only if we can find a mediating third thing that is both pure, meaning non-empirical, and sensible at the same time.
It has to have a foot in both worlds.
A foot in both worlds. That guidance is provided by what he calls the transcendental schematism.
This is famously one of the most difficult parts of the book. The schema is the mediator. What exactly is it?
The schema is the transcendental product of imagination. It's the crucial, necessary link. It connects the abstract category, the pure concept, to a specific, sensible determination. And that determination is always time.
Time.
Time is the universal medium for all of our appearances. It's the common denominator between the pure intellectual category and the messy, sensuous intuition. So the schema is simply the category temporalized. It's a rule for how to apply a category in time.
Why does it have to be time? Why not space?
Because space only applies to external objects, to things outside of us. But time applies to everything, both external objects and our own internal states. Time is the universal condition under which all things must appear to us, and so it's the only medium that's abstract enough to contain pure concepts, but also concrete enough to apply to objects. The schemata are, in his words, nothing but a priori determinations of time in accordance with rules.
Okay, can you walk us through some of the examples in detail so we can really see this connection between the intellectual concept and the temporal role he's talking about?
Absolutely. Let's take three critical examples. First, the category of quantity or magnitude. The pure concept is just how much. Its schema is number.
Number.
Number is not a concept you derive from experience. It involves the successive addition of homogeneous units over time. The concept of five is the consciousness of this unity of successively adding one, then another one, then another one. It's a process in time.
So we can only conceive of quantity by basically running a mental stopwatch and sequentially adding units. The concept is defined by the necessary temporal process.
Exactly. Next, let's take the category of substance. The intellectual concept is simply something permanent, what underlies change. Its schema is permanence of the real in time. It serves as the substrate of empirical determination of time in general. Substance is defined for us as that which persists while all its accidental properties change in time.
It's the fixed anchor point in the constantly changing stream of our experience.
And finally, the category of cause. The pure concept is just ground or necessity. Its schema is the real upon which, whenever is posited, something else always follows according to a rule. This is the schema of necessary succession in time. The schematism is Kant's proof that the fundamental structure of all objective experience, the necessity of quantity, permanence, and cause, is actually derived from the innate power of the mind to determine the universal condition of time.
Okay, so the transcendental analytic has established the necessary rules for legitimate knowledge, the laws of the understanding, and they're all confined to experience. But we started by saying reason is naturally burdened with questions that go beyond experience.
Right.
So now we have to turn to the transcendental dialectic and explore that overreach, where all these carefully constructed rules start to break down.
This is where reason inevitably moves beyond the necessary rules that are established by the categories and seeks what he calls the unconditioned.
The unconditioned.
Reason operates through this natural human impulse to systematize and complete things. When we engage in syllogistic reasoning, trying to find the ultimate condition for any given condition statement, this process naturally pushes us toward the totality of the conditions for any given condition.
It's like the human mind hates loose ends. It must trace the causal chain all the way back to a first cause, or trace the limit itself back to some ultimate simple source.
Precisely. And since that totality implies the unconditioned, the condition that doesn't rely on anything else, reason is driven by its very nature to create concepts that have no corresponding sensory intuition. They can't be schematized. And these are the pure concepts of reason, or what he calls the ideas.
And he's borrowing that term from Plato, isn't he?
He is, and it's worth pausing to look at that influence. Kant acknowledges Plato's genius here, noting that Platonic ideas far surpass even the concepts of understanding. But he saw that Plato found the chief instances of his ideas in the field of the practical in morality, in what rests on freedom.
Like justice or the good.
Right. Plato correctly saw that these practical ideas are never met with perfectly in experience, but they still must be recognized as having their own reality, as archetypes. Kant aligns with this view for the moral ideas. But he gives this great warning against confusing this deep philosophical term idea with every common or arbitrary representation, like, a recipe for a cake.
So Kant's ideas are the necessary destinations for reason's journey, even if they are destinations we can't actually map using our empirical rules. What are the specific targets of this inherent philosophical drive?
There are three of them. Three necessary transcendental ideas that define rational philosophy, and they structure the entire dialectic. They map onto the three traditional objects of metaphysics, and each one seeks a different kind of unconditioned totality.
Okay, what's the first one?
First is the absolute unity of the thinking subject. The ego, the soul. This is the object of rational psychology. Reason seeks the unconditioned, simple substance that must underlie all of our thoughts.
And the second?
Second is the absolute unity of the series of conditions of appearances. The world. This is the object of rational cosmology. Here, reason seeks the totality of the world, its beginning in time, its ultimate components.
And finally, the ultimate ground of everything.
Yes, third is the absolute unity, the condition of all objects of thought in general, which is God. This is the object of rational theology. Reason seeks the highest ground of all possibility, the being of all beings.
So these three ideas, soul, world, God, are the core of traditional metaphysics. And Kant's meta-note here is that these three are all interconnected through the practical domain, through morality.
Yes, he says metaphysics really has three ideas only: God, freedom, and immortality. And they're interconnected in such a way that the second, freedom, combined with the first, God, leads us to the third, immortality. But here is the danger. When speculative reason tries to treat these ideas as if they were real, empirical objects subject to the categories.
When it tries to put them under the microscope.
Yes, it steps outside the bounds of all possible experience and it falls directly into unavoidable dialectical illusion.
So now we get to see the inevitable breakdown, the dialectic in action. Reason attempts to use the categories which are only valid for experience on these transcendent ideas, and the result is a set of systematic, predictable fallacies.
Exactly.
Let's look at the self first then, the source of all our experience.
The first type of illusion is what Kant calls the paralogism of the soul. It's directed toward the thinking subject. And the inference is powerfully intuitive. It goes like this. Because the phrase, I think, must be able to accompany all my representations, establishing a logical unity of consciousness.
It's the common thread through all my experiences.
It is. From that, the thinking subject is inferred to be a simple, indivisible, permanent substance, a non-material soul. Kant calls this the Achilles of all dialectical inferences.
Why is it the Achilles? Is it because it's so persuasive that it seems immune to any attack?
That's it, exactly. It's the most appealing metaphysical conclusion because it seems to be based on our own immediate self-awareness. However, the critique shows that this inference confuses the logical unity of consciousness, the mere fact that the I must accompany my thoughts, with the real simplicity of the subject itself.
So we're confusing the necessary logical vehicle of thought, the I, with the actual ontological status of the being who is doing the thinking.
Yes. The proposition, I am substance, is analytically true. It's a definition. But it only serves to determine an object in general. It doesn't tell us anything about the nature of that substance. We have no possible intuition, no sensory input of the subject in itself, beyond what he calls the logical meaning of the I.
We only experience our changing mental states.
Right. The very structure of our inner sense, which is time, only allows us to perceive our internal states as they change. Therefore, we can't arrive at any knowledge of the soul's permanent simplicity through pure reason alone. The paralogism tricks us into using the empty logical shell of the I to prove the material existence of a simple, eternal substance. It's an illusion.
Okay, so if the paralogisms are about reason misapplying a concept to the subject, the antinomies are about reason falling into necessary self-contradiction when it tries to grasp the world as a total object. This is reason literally fighting itself.
It is. The antinomies are unavoidable because they arise when reason seeks the unconditioned totality of conditions in the world of appearances. And since the world is structured by our forms of intuition, space, and time, when we apply the categories to find the unconditioned, the result is four pairs of contradictory propositions, a thesis and an antithesis, where both sides appear equally defensible using pure reason.
Let's delve into the first two of those. Let's start with the first antinomy, the conflict concerning the world's magnitude in time and space.
Okay, so the problem here is the totality of the universe. The thesis argues, the world must have a beginning in time and it must be limited in space. It's finite.
And the reasoning?
The reasoning is that if it had no beginning, then an infinite series of past events must have elapsed up to this moment. And an infinite series, by definition, can never be completed, so it's impossible to traverse.
That makes sense. What about the other side?
The antithesis argues the opposite. The world has no beginning in time and no limits in space. It is infinite in both. The reasoning here is that if it had a beginning, there must have been an empty time before it. But nothing can emerge from a state of nothing without a cause, which contradicts the whole concept of necessary causality.
So either way, you go finite or infinite pure reason ends up contradicting itself. How does Kant resolve this impasse?
The crucial insight Kant provides is that the contradiction is only apparent. It's an illusion, because the question itself is based on a false transcendental assumption.
It is.
That the world is a thing in itself, a completed totality that exists independently of our experience. Kant argues that the true transcendental concept of infinitude is that the successive synthesis of units required for the enumeration of a quantum can never be completed.
So the world is only an appearance.
It's an infinite task of synthesis that can never be finalized by a finite mind. If the world is only an infinite series of appearances that we are constantly building, then it's neither absolutely finite nor absolutely infinite as a completed whole. The question itself is invalid. And so the contradiction vanishes when we limit the scope of our claims to experience.
That is the power of the Copernican turn in action. So let's look at the second antinomy. This one deals with the internal structure of matter. Is it made of simple parts, or is it infinitely divisible?
Yes. The question here is ultimate composition. The thesis states, every composite substance in the world is made up of simple parts. It's atomistic. The logic is that if you deny simple parts, then composition itself must vanish, and then nothing would exist at all.
And the antithesis?
The antithesis states,
Yeah.
nowhere in the world does there exist anything simple, but everything is infinitely composite. Division just goes on indefinitely. Every part that occupies space is itself composite, because space is infinitely divisible.
So again, we're stuck. If simple parts exist, they have to occupy space, which means they must be composite. That's a contradiction. But if there's indefinite divisibility, the very concept of substance, of something permanent and fixed, seems to just dissolve.
Exactly, and the transcendental resolution is the same. The objects of the physical world are only appearances. They are representations structured by our senses. When we try to impose the category of a simple thing in itself onto an appearance, the contradiction is generating.
They aren't things in themselves.
As appearances, they're only representations, and the division of a representation is just an infinite process that is never completed by our understanding. Since they're only representations, they are only as visible as our understanding requires them to be. They don't possess a fixed, absolute composition as things in themselves. The dialectic's great triumph is showing that these unavoidable conflicts are not defects in nature, but defects in misapplied reason.
So we have now systematically mapped reason's capabilities in the analytic, and we've demonstrated its boundaries and its inevitable errors in the dialectic. What are the ultimate life-altering implications of establishing these necessary limits of speculative reason?
Well, we must first accept a profound loss, at least in the speculative realm. Kant says it is apodeictically certain, meaning absolutely and necessarily true, that reason will never discover conclusive demonstrations for the existence of God or a future life.
Why not?
Because these are synthetic assertions that do not relate to any object of possible experience, and so they cannot be proven using the categories of the understanding. The path of dogmatic, speculative proof is forever closed.
So the purpose of the critique isn't to tell us what is true about ultimate reality, but really to prevent us from being intellectually misled by false assurances.
Precisely. The goal is not neutrality or mere doubt. That would just be skepticism. The critique is an act of intellectual governance. It's about submitting reason itself, in the whole extent of its powers, to a thorough examination in order to determine its determinate and necessary limits. It's about defining what we are necessarily ignorant of. Not just about a few facts, but about the fundamental boundaries of human knowledge itself.
The source material also emphasizes why philosophical proofs can't work like mathematical proofs, particularly when it comes to using negation.
This is a crucial distinction he makes. Philosophical proofs, especially when you're in the domain of transcendental illusion, cannot rely on the apagogic method. That's proof by refuting the opposite, reductio ad absurdum.
Which works perfectly in math.
Flawlessly. Because in math, concepts are constructed in pure intuition. But in philosophy, when we're dealing with things beyond any possible experience, the opposite of a proposition often contradicts only subjective conditions of thought, not the object itself.
And we saw this with the antinomies. Both the thesis and the antithesis could seemingly be refuted by the other side.
Exactly. The contradiction just remains because the method is completely inadequate outside of its proper sphere. The critique forces philosophy to abandon this dream of mathematical certainty and rely instead on a deduction based on the necessary conditions of possible experience. The critical method, this tribunal of reason, it replaces the dogmatic reliance on false logical certainty.
Okay, so if the speculative domain is now closed to ultimate certainty regarding these transcendent ideas, where does that leave the human spirit? Does the critique provide any hope at all for the things we care about most? God, freedom, immortality?
It provides immense hope, but it relocates the entire basis of our certainty from the intellectual realm to the moral realm. The ultimate end of pure reason, Kant argues, lies in the practical realm, in the moral law. We discovered that there is an absolutely necessary practical employment of pure reason, the moral, in which it inevitably goes beyond the limits of sensibility.
So we can't know that we are free through observation or logic, because freedom is, by definition, unconditioned. But we have to assume we are free in order to be moral agents. Otherwise, moral responsibility is completely meaningless.
That is the core of the practical triumph. The moral imperative itself provides the footing for these transcendent ideas, right, where speculative reason failed. The world ought to be represented as a moral world, an intelligible world based on moral laws. And this moral world can and ought to have an influence on the sensible world. Practical reason connects the purposiveness we see in nature with freedom, and this leads to what he calls a transcendental theology, a theology that's derived from moral necessity, not from speculative proof.
And this is the critical distinction he makes between Wissen, knowledge, and Glauben, belief or faith.
Yes, Kant makes this distinction to protect those vital interests of humanity. He says, and I'm quoting, "No one indeed will be able to boast that he knows that there is a God and a future life. Knowledge, Wissen, if it concerns an object of mere reason, must be logically communicable and demonstrable to everyone."
But belief is different.
But our conviction in these matters, the certainty that God and immortality exist, is not logical, but moral certainty. It's grounded in the necessity of maintaining our moral laws. It's an intrinsic conviction that I cannot disclaim without becoming abhorrent in my own eyes. It is a subjective, practical necessity, and that is what ultimately saves those core interests of humanity from the destructive dialectical conflicts of speculative reason.
So at the end of this massive, difficult journey, what's the enduring value of the critique?
I think the enduring value is that by defining the necessary limits of the mind, he shows that the loss of speculative certainty only affects the monopoly of the schools and no respect the interests of humanity. Kant made these essential concepts of human concern available to the great mass of men. He argues that once the schools limit themselves to universally comprehensible and for moral purposes sufficient grounds of proof, they actually gain greater authority.
It sounds like he's advocating for a permanent intellectual modesty, a deep warning against dogmatism and easy speculation about things of which they understand nothing. He is telling us, be critical of your own critical faculty.
Exactly. The whole point of the critique is to subject reason itself to a discipline, a kind of negative instruction to guard against error. And if reason, our highest cognitive authority, requires such intense discipline to restrain its own innate tendency toward extravagance and illusion, towards dialectic, then we must constantly be critical of our own premises. We have to question where our concepts derive their material validity from.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you to consider. Kant established this radical difference between philosophical knowledge, which is deduced from concepts alone and needs proof, and mathematical knowledge, which is constructed in intuition and can often be axiomatic. The philosophical drive, as we saw, is always toward the totality, the unconditioned.
So if reason itself requires this discipline to avoid confusing mere illusion with genuine truth, the difference between a formally appealing dialectic and a grounded analytic, then we should ask ourselves, what parts of our modern intellectual landscape are currently suffering from a lack of this Kantian self-imposed discipline? Where are we mistaking a logically appealing yet empirically empty concept, an idea without a schema for a demonstrable real truth, simply because we desire that unconditioned certainty in complex systems?
From predictive AI models to political ideologies.
Exactly. The critique is not just a piece of history. It is a permanent manual for navigating intellectual claims.
A truly enduring and necessary challenge. We hope this deep dive into the revolutionary structure of the critique of pure reason has given you a secure path through this foundational text, allowing you to distinguish between what you can claim to know and what you must accept as a necessary belief. We'll see you next time.